Good afternoon. Hopefully, can everyone hear me? Can I have some nods if you can hear me? That's a good start. You can see me as well. I thought I'd start by letting you see me before I put up some PowerPoint slides and showing you what we're going to do. So, as Elizabeth said, welcome everybody. Great to have so many people on the session today. And just to let you know that this is obviously a course that's been pulled together to be quite responsive to the current situation. And as a lot of you know, it's a rapidly changing environment. So I would encourage you all as much as possible to interact with the session through the chat function. There'll be opportunities for questions at various stages. So please do feedback. And then the various sessions today and tomorrow, we'll look to answer as many of your questions as possible. If we're not answering your questions, let me know, use the chat function, and I'll do whatever I can to respond to those. Also fully aware that we've got a real range of museum professionals on the call today. You've all got your own areas of expertise. We've attempted to design a course that will cover off a lot of your questions about reopening and planning for reopening, a number of the operational challenges, look at case studies from around the world. And so that's the plan to go through. So I'm going to move now to share my screen, which I'm sure is going to work absolutely seamlessly, and no one's going to pick up on this. Hopefully you can all see a set of slides. Yeah? Thumbs up. Everyone can see that? Great. So without further ado, I'm going to push through these and say housekeeping. Please do use the chat function, is what it's there for. We're going to do a few exercises where we're going to be using the chat function quite heavily, so I'll make sure I've got that and visible in my line of sight too. The session is being recorded, as you've all been made aware, and I think Elizabeth said at the beginning of the session, if you wanted to be edited out, if you didn't want to appear in it, then please let her know directly via email. Please feel free to share your participation on social media, London Museum Development, myself, Walters Consulting, and feel free to share anything that you find useful. Ultimately, I think what everybody's trying to do at the moment is build a conversation and deal with a completely unprecedented situation. I know myself, I've been involved in a large number of forums. There's a lot of questions out there. What you're going to get today is the positioning of some of those questions. It's going to be looking at how other organisations have responded to those, what some of the solutions can be, and some of it may be exploring questions that we don't fully have the answer for. But we're going to leave you from these sessions with a good understanding of addressing some of the key challenges of knowing where you can get more information from, and hopefully also within this community that's on this call and the wider community, building the conversation much further. So I look forward to engaging with all of you as we go through the next 2 afternoons together. So the timetable, for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you would have noticed on day one there was a slight error in the timing, only of a few minutes. So this is a slightly updated timing. Luckily, after these introductions, I've skipped to the right screen. I've allowed a little bit more time for the introductions and icebreakers. So we split this into 4 sessions over 2 days. The first session now, we're going to just look at the very high-level positioning, particularly referencing UK government advice. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this already, but we're going to explore how that can be applied to a museum context. And then we're going to look to identify some of the key challenges, and there's going to be some interactive work around that. So session 1 this afternoon is very much setting the scene, and maybe a number of you know this already, that's fine, but let's get us all up to the same page and where our understanding is of what we're doing. Then the second session today, we're going to be looking at best practice. We're going to be joined by Stephen Dollimore from Museum of London, who's going to talk about how they're planning for reopening and where they are in that journey. I think a lot of that's going to be as much about the process they're going through to plan for opening, as much as what the solutions are going to be. Like many of you, they're still scratching their heads trying to come up with solutions, but I think that's going to be a really interesting piece. Then I'm going to take you on a journey and look through some international case studies and look at what the trends are globally. So some of you may have seen on Twitter, I've been collating global tracking information about museum reopening and posting that every week. So we're looking at what some of those trends are, and then taking the opportunity to see how those trends and those solutions could be applied in a UK setting. And then tomorrow, we're going to start to go into more detail. So we're going to look very much at individual areas of operation. These are the ones we selected around visitor social distancing, staff welfare and protection, cleaning regimes, cafes, shops, toilets and lifts. So we're going to go into some very kind of key areas. By the way, after today's session, or you can use the chat functions, if there's particular topics you want to look at tomorrow that you don't feel are going to be covered off by those lists, let me know and I'll endeavour to include as much of those as possible. So this is our programme for the next 2 days. So just to give you a bit of background for those of you who don't know me, Ben Mellon, as I said already, I'm Director of Mortis Consulting. Founded over 3 years ago now. We work exclusively in the UK cultural sector with museums and galleries. Within the last 12 months, we've been working with the British Library, Royal Museums Greenwich, Imperial War Museum, Somerset House Trust, the Museum of London. I've got a list here of others. The British Film Institute, working on facilities management, on visitor experience, and Royal Household and Royal Collection. We do a lot of work around collection care, collection storage reviews. We do all sorts. So we're kind of working very broadly across the UK cultural sector. Aside from that, I'm involved in quite a few other forums where I'm looking to help build the conversation. The International Museum Construction Congress brings together architects, designers, clients from all over the world to discuss upcoming museum projects. I'm actually going to be chairing, it was due to be 2020, it's now moving to 2021. For some of you may know already, I founded the Cultural Sector FM Hub, which brings together about 60, 70 UK institutions, those in client-side roles with responsibility for facilities, management and operational management. So we've got Tish on the course today, and Tish has been to some of our events and actually kindly hosted us at the Postal Museum. We have site visits, obviously pre-lockdown. We had a conference at the V&A last year with about 200 attendees, and during lockdown we've been running webinars that are free to attend. The whole group's free to be part of, so please do go to the website and email the hub. And there's a very active WhatsApp group that's been sharing lots of information about dealing with lockdown. For some of you might not know, if you're on Twitter, I'm also the person behind Museum Toilets on Twitter. So just putting that one out there. You might have to stop me if I talk too much about toilets. I do talk about toilets a lot. There's actually going to be a standalone webinar next Tuesday that's actually looking just at toilet solutions across the sector. And I think we've got about 200 attendees booked in already. So I can send you around the details via Elizabeth for that, if any of you want to attend another free to attend webinar. I spoke at the Museums Association conference last year on museum toilets. I've also been contributing to the ALVA weekly webinars and presented at one of those 2 weeks ago. So I'm involved in lots of conversations, but I think like most of us, we all work in this sector because we're really passionate about it and we choose to work here. And particularly during lockdown, this is well, don't use the term lightly, but it is a crisis for the sector. And I think everybody who's got a role, regardless of where they sit in the operation of museums, galleries, other cultural institutions, has a part to play in rebuilding. And hopefully this conversation today is another part of that, where we can all help each other, not reinvent the wheel, learn from each other, share best practice. And that's what we're really looking to achieve today. So that's me, and I won't bore you too much with much of that. I wanted you to all start using the chat function. For those of you who've been on one of my training courses before, I love a pub quiz, but we couldn't quite make that work today. So this one's just a bit of a chat, get involved in a conversation, get you using it. And just using the chat function, so those of you who haven't used Zoom before, I just want you to kind of just type in kind of whatever you want to put. You can write in, you don't have to write, by the way. What are you most concerned about when planning for the reopening of your site? So I think this is quite a good scene set. So I'm sure you could probably all say everything, but just toilets. Yeah, happy to talk about toilets, Nicola. Yeah, toilets. Oh, should we just run a toilets webinar? We can just do that if you want. I'm happy to. I think toilets are a really interesting one, by the way, because it is a point where the solutions globally don't seem to be coming in. There's not many good case studies. They're high touch point areas. They're often a point where you bring large numbers of visitors together. Often we've all struggled with our toilet provision even before this crisis, and are quite concerned about managing it. Staff and volunteer welfare, I think it's right to bring that up. Ultimately, our staff and volunteers have to be happy about coming back onto site before anything else happens. We're covering that tomorrow. Cash sales, I think that's a really interesting one. I know a lot of institutions have come out and said, well, we're only going to accept contactless payment, or what does that mean? Does that actually preclude some of your visitors coming to site who only use cash? Yeah, visitor signage. I think signage is a really important one. So there's an awful lot coming through, so I'm trying to kind of keep track of these. I can expand that. That's useful. Visitor experience, including toilet. We're actually going to start off with this, thinking about the visitor experience, particularly in some of the feedback and data that's coming through about what visitors are expecting when they come to the building. Well, staff visitor wellbeing. I think it's really important that a number of you are putting staff and staff welfare right at the heart of this. You're going to be expecting an awful lot from your staff and volunteers in the coming months, and putting them into these situations. That has to be a number one priority. Schools, loss of income. I think that's a really interesting one. And I know this is an equation that a number of people are struggling with at the moment, which is is it cost effective to open? If you put in the amount of resources that it appears that you may need to manage some of these measures, it's even worth opening the doors, which is a horrible thing to say. And what your strategies are around that are going to be really important. Community events. Yeah, so basically how we bring our spaces, our museums have been designed to bring people together. And then we're now saying we're going to try and bring them together but keep them apart. It's a bit of a contradiction. So we're thinking about that. PPE signage, yeah, we're definitely going to go into PPE tomorrow in more detail. Interactive elements. So for the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a real push to make our institutions as interactive as possible. And now we're saying don't. And we're also having to think about what does the visitor experience look like if you walk into a gallery and all the interactives, I've got signs on them saying, do not touch, do not engage. What's that actually done to the experience? And some really interesting discussions I've been in recently is about saying, what's the impact on that visitor experience? And therefore, ultimately, we need to create spaces where our visitors can engage, can learn, can be happy and enjoy the space. And we've got to make sure that ultimately we open up a space that does that for all of our visitors. Also as well about access to exhibits and museum learning activities, including schools. I think the schools piece is really important about bringing those back in, which is going to be very much a collaborative solution in place between your institution and the schools, and also just seeing what we are in other sectors, and particularly in education, that schools are interpreting their requirements and how they manage differently between schools as well, so that you may have some differences there. So there's a few more coming in, really useful. And by the way, the chat function is brilliant for sending questions and comments to me. It's also great for you to communicate with each other. So please feel free to use the chat function to ask each other questions as we go through. If while I'm talking, I come up with something and you want to ask other people what they think about that, feel free to use the chat function to do that as well. So absolutely fine that you do that. Shops, yeah, the shops, I'm going to definitely talk about those over the next 2 days as well. And equally, when looking at shops and other elements, we are going to be looking for best practice and case studies beyond the museum sector as well, because obviously shops, retails are opening ahead of everybody else. So just want to finish up in terms of this little icebreaker, again using the chat function. What are you most looking forward to? So let's be positive. I know there's a lot of concern around reopening your sites, but have a think now about what is it you're looking forward to about opening those doors up again. And that might be a more tricky question to answer than what the concerns are. Seeing our volunteers again, yeah, absolutely. Volunteers are a really interesting one that I think we're trying to cover off as well. That a lot of them may be in demographics that are particularly at risk, and so the management of volunteers is something that needs to be really carefully thought about. Interact with people. I think, yeah, there's people mentioning about bringing team volunteers back in. I think it's really important. A lot of them who've been obviously distanced from your physical institutions. It'll be interesting actually over the next 2 days to hear about how you've been interacting with those and how you're using those staff to prepare for reopening, even though they may not, all volunteers may not be on site. Happy visitors, yeah. And I think we'll talk about it as well, about what we're working towards, and is it a return to normal or is it a return to a new normal that we didn't have before? I think that's going to be a really interesting one. Yeah, welcoming back customers, volunteers, seeing how the public react as well. And I think another theme I'm really keen to explore over the coming 2 days is, are there opportunities here about changing the visitor experience in response to COVID-19 restrictions that could also actually be of benefit to the visitor experience? Kind of something slightly contrary, and maybe we haven't been thinking about. Well, I think there's some opportunities there. So thank you everyone for your feedback. So as we do these, I'm not necessarily going to call them out, but hopefully it's also interesting for all of you to see that live chat function as it comes through, and for you to kind of pick up and read as we come in. So I'm just going to move to the next slide. Mindful of timing, we are on time. So let's set the context. I won't kind of labour this one too much because I think you all know where we are now. At a really high level, and this is just kind of a very kind of abridged version that said, we dealt with an initial phase at the beginning of the year where we were starting to operate the sites, but restrictions were starting to come into place, and we were beginning to think about what those might look like. And then within March, then obviously sites were forced to close. There was a lot of operational change management in those first couple of weeks. How do you move to that new normal? How do you operate your sites during lockdown? And then everyone's particularly in the last kind of 6 weeks, 8 weeks, everyone's been getting to more a steady state. But particularly since the government made announcements about the potential to reopen from July. For cultural, for museums and galleries in particular, everyone started to move into more of a planning phase, and I think that's where we are at the moment. You're all going to be at a different point on this journey, by the way, and I'm not expecting some of you who are joining today, it's because you've done an awful lot of planning, and then you've got some things that you need to kind of iron out. Others of you haven't been thought about. Maybe some of you have been furloughed and you're only just coming back into this. Maybe some of you are furloughed at the moment and just starting to get the cogs whirring about what that planning needs to be, and we'll talk about that as well. And then moving into this recovery kind of post-July onwards, we'll look at the phasing of reopening, and I'm talking about July onwards because I know a number of institutions aren't all necessarily going to reopen on the first day that they can, and that phasing has to be based on local risk assessment. You have to be comfortable before you open your site, although there will always be pressures, particularly economic ones, to get the doors open as quickly as possible. So here we are in this middle phase, and because of that, we're not going to be focusing too much on managing buildings that are closed, although if you've got any questions, I'm happy to kind of bring those ones up. We're going to focus more around the planning for reopening and what you might need to be thinking about, and hopefully as well come up with some areas that and items that you may not have thought of that would then go into featuring your planning. So again, just further setting the context, when we're opening, a lot of you will be asking these kind of questions, I'm sure. Will we be opening the doors to a safe building? That's the number one question. Is it? We all have a moral and legal responsibility to open, to operate safe sites. We need to have confidence as museum professionals that those buildings will be safe. Where do we get the guidance from? This is something we're going to come on. There's an awful lot of information. You guys are joining this webinar, fantastic. You could probably fill up your diary with 100 webinars during the week if you wanted to on various different elements of reopening. Where's the guidance coming from? I'll be making some recommendations. I'll actually also be asking you guys later as part of the homework session about if you have any good recommendations that would be useful to share in the group and use that kind of community effort here. How your visitors and staff feel about the new measures. What's that change going to feel like? At what extent are you going to be able to deliver the visitor experiences that will meet the expectations of your visitors? There's a real risk here, actually. And one is that we open up sites and create a visitor experience that is not inviting, that isn't welcoming, that it doesn't cause enjoyment, and it could actually be detrimental to the brand and the future visitor uptake of your organisation. So I think it's really important. We've got to keep that visitor experience in mind. And I'm sure many of you have been putting work over many years to make sure that your sites deliver all of these. We've got to make sure that just because of some short-term reactions, we don't damage many of those too quickly. How will your visitor profile be different? Having a think around that as well, and then therefore how do your operations need to be different in response to that, and will we be ready to react quickly and adjust operations rapidly in response to visitor feedback? And another one that's not on the list here, it's worth thinking about, is potentially responding to future change as well. So God forbid there's going to be another lockdown, but do we need to think about preparing for further restrictions coming into place at a point in the future? There's been talk in the media about a second spike, potentially forecasting that for the autumn winter. Does our planning also need to incorporate that we may need to lock down further? So this may need to be a flexible model that allows you to open up parts of your sites and then close them back down again, and we need to be thinking about that as we go through. So hopefully these kind of problem statements are kind of ringing true with you all, and you're all nodding along and going, yeah, these are the kind of questions I want answered. Like I said, so Yvette's gone on there and mentioned the NMDC guidance. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. So there is some central guidance coming out that we're kind of waiting for at the moment that will be coming through, and we'll talk about that as we go through the session. So some of you may have seen this already, but I thought it was worth sharing. So this is the ALVA, Association of Leading Visitor Attractors, have been doing surveys with visitors around what they think the returns are going to be to sites are going to look like. So this was undertaken in late May, so it's already a few weeks out of date. I think they're currently doing another one as well at the moment, but I think it's just, I'm setting some of these statements out there just for us to think about our visitors and what that's going to be. So some of the key takeaways for me that at this point in May, a large number of people didn't anticipate returning to visitor attractions for about 5 months. So one of the problem statements, and we're going to talk about today, particularly for those of you in London, because you're all London sites, but particularly those who are more central, is as much as you do on your sites locally, people may be unwilling to go on public transport to get there. So you may have the perfect site that visitors are incredibly comfortable. Public transport may be a limiter, and that needs to feature in your planning and one of the key risk elements. I know a number of the nationals are really thinking about this and potentially delaying their reopening because they're concerned about the confidence in the public to use public transport. So I think the stat, I'm just move my things around the side. There'll also be a knock-on effect from the level of confidence in using public transport, especially in London. Currently, 21% say they will feel confident on public transport when lockdown eases. 61% will not. That's a high percentage, and particularly as well, we're making the assumption that for a period of time that international visitors are also not going to be travelling to London for a significant period. If there's also a lack of confidence in public transport, there are ways that we can counter this. And this is what we'll talk about in the next few days, particularly around how can you make your visitors as comfortable as possible? How can you share information, make sure that they're comfortable before they even come to your site? And what can you also look to do to facilitate other types of transport and particularly appeal to local audiences as well and get them comfortable coming to site? So concern about the level of the crowds is a major barrier. So particularly those being in confined spaces, how they enforce social distancing. Interesting, if you look at the data, it says that visitors are more concerned about other visitors than they are about museum staff. So they're quite confident the museum staff will know what they're doing and will control. What their actual concern is over other visitors. And I think that's a really interesting point to make. And evidently you guys have pulled up yourselves, but they're from the survey work, the visitors are highlighting toilets, indoor cafes, interactives, regularly touch service as their areas of concerns. So you need to think about, there's some really good data here from Alva and other sources about how you communicate this to your visitors before they come to site, and how can you make them comfortable about all these elements as we come through. So cleaning is one, and we'll touch on that more tomorrow. But for example, we've often tried to make cleaners in our sites as invisible as possible to not impact on the visitor experience. But actually, do we want cleaners to be very visible? Is it going to make people a lot more reassured on the site if they see a cleaner cleaning door handles, cleaning surfaces, and all those other kind of things? And when it comes to cleaning as well, we've got Libby joining tomorrow, and we'll be talking more around, particularly if you've got historic fabric and collections as well, and the potential impacts of cleaning on those as well. So we will come to that. So this is just another way to kind of cut the same data, as you'll see from the same Alva visitor survey. There's this is the link to the survey. I don't know if Alva have actually published it on their website, but the Association of Independent Museums actually have a copy on their website in their coronavirus section. So you can go on there and you can actually download the whole PowerPoint presentation. But I just picked a couple of slides out so you can see what Alva are talking about. So basically, they're a lot more anxious about any indoor spaces, and cafes and toilets are right at the top. And I think what's really interesting, particularly around reopening, we've mentioned toilets, is that the toilets are something you need to have. Well, some institutions in France have actually said they're not opening their toilets, which is quite an interesting position to take. So think about how those toilets open, and equally the impact of any of those decisions on maybe precluding certain visitors coming into your sites. And cafes and restaurants may be something that's easier to manage a slightly different model, but those are kind of key areas. But people aren't as concerned about shops and other areas, but these come through. So this kind of helps us prioritise thinking what the visitors may be concerned about, and this is why we selected some of the topics, particularly for tomorrow, to highlight on. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Any of you who know me, by the way, you know that when I get talking, you can always tell me in the chat if you want me to slow down a bit, or if there's any bits I go through too quickly, then I'm happy to kind of recap. We've been quite ambitious in the amount of content we're trying to cover in the next 2 days, but we are still on schedule as we speak. So, in summary, I want to go through this quite quickly because I think you all know what the problems are, but I think it's some useful sort of data. When this started, we may have been planning for when new normal will return. We're now planning for a new normal. So I'm going to be perfectly honest. When this all started, I was there going, okay, they close the museums and galleries. How long till we reopen? And let's start planning in a model that gets us to that point. Now, I think the expectation is that new normal is something quite different. We're being told that some restrictions may be in place for the next 12 to 18 months. So we're living with a new normal now. This may even take even longer. How do we make sure that our solutions are sustainable and will work as equally well now and in 12 months' time? And also having a think that you see a number of solutions, particularly in the retail environment. For example, people queuing outside of stores. That works now. Does that still work if it's February or January with people queuing outside of institutions? Does that work? So thinking about the sustainability of those solutions is really important. By the way, as we're going to do a little summary at the end of each session, And as I said here, please share any key takeaways in the chat functions or any items that you think are particularly pertinent. Then it's always good to do that. I think someone's just talking about the ALVA report. I'm assuming that you alluded to. Yeah, that can be. Oh, it's on the AIM, the Association of Independent Museums website. They've got that in their coronavirus section. And also that the expectations and concerns of our staff, volunteers and visitors have changed and will change further. Are we ready to respond to those? Big question here, and this is what we're thinking about. That even in the last 4 weeks, I think the general public perception about social distancing, about implementation of measures, as the data changes around infection rates, everything else, you can feel those shifting, and in some retail environments and others, and those are only going to change further about how we manage those. For example, if in other sectors they're taking a very relaxed approach to social distancing, and then they enter a museum environment and it's quite rigid, what does that mean? Or vice versa. So we need to we need to be cognizant of wider elements. William, thanks for sharing the link. It's on the chat function now for the ALVA Attractions Recovery Tracker. I just quite like this quote. This is one to kind of take a pause and a breath as I throw information at you, and just saying, and while we're all thinking about this, museums are like parks, spaces in which the individual experience can intertwine with the public space of being together. In the coming months, as a society, we face the challenge to find a new positive balance between personal freedom and a care for our relationship with others. And I think this is probably one of the real challenges that a lot of you are really working on at the moment, which is creating these spaces that still achieve all the things you wanted to achieve before, but are managed in a slightly different way. And I think this is so this is the link to the quote from the art newspaper from the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art is at the bottom there, if you wanted to find that quote yourselves. So that's quite a nice one, just to round that section off. So, guidance and sources of information. So, there's a lot of information out there. There's not so much sector specific, or there is some, and we're going to talk about that later, although, as it's been alluded to, the National Museum Directors Council are collaborating with other museum organisations to publish a set of guidance, which is due out in the middle of this month. I think somebody actually even said it's the 19th of June. So we'll be waiting for that. However, just want to set expectations here is if it's, having seen similar guidance in other countries, they are trying to talk to a very broad sector with very diverse institutions and sites. Expect that a lot of the advice will be quite generic, and equally for all of these forms, I think that's probably the one thing we're seeing is some very generic advice, and particularly the style being taken in the UK is to provide that generic guidance and allow you to interpret it. So one of the key messages that I'm going to keep saying all the way through this is you have to incorporate and digest all of this generic high-level guidance, but ultimately make your own risk assessments at a local level. I think it's really important. You just need to be thinking about, you need to be comfortable and think about how you apply these, look for best practice. And if you're searching for definitive answers on X, Y, or Z, they're probably not going to be there. The best thing to do, and my advice is, in this forum, is to collaborate with your peers, individuals, institutions, look globally, see what everyone else is doing. But what we're going to go through now, at a reasonable pace, because I'm assuming you've seen all this, is just start to think about some of the high-level government advice, because ultimately this is what we're adhering to as much as there's sector-specific advice, and think about how we apply this in a museum setting. So just go through this. So that was I'll come to that slide gets repeated at the end. So high-level advice from the government website. Hopefully you've all seen this. You're all fully aware of what the government are telling us, but we're just going to go quickly through their top 5 points about for any business individuals about how they're doing. And do you know something? I think we've been bombarded over the last 12 weeks with the government advice at a really high level. I think this is actually quite a good point to come back and just refresh yourself on what they're saying, and equally have a think about some of these are likely to change. And I know, as an example, we'll come to it, there's a lot of lobbying happening around the 2-meter social distancing about whether that's going to be maintained. So there are some key measures in here that will have a real impact on how you operate. But number one, in terms of the government's top 5 things you need to be thinking about before restarting work or your workplace, think about the safety of your workplace. Carry out risk assessments in line with HSE guidance. So the HSE website has lots of tools around risk assessment. I'm sure many of you have these already. These can be quite high level. I think it's really important that you think about your risk assessment tools going forward. And if you want, we can talk around these. because while the guidance remains vague, if you are concerned about future challenge at any point around your response to this, one of your key defences will be the fact that you can demonstrate that you've undertaken reasonable risk assessment of any given measure that you've put in place. So really think about your risk assessment. Use standard risk assessment tools, either from the HSE or your own tailored ones. Think about each individual risk and really think about those local nuances and differences that you're working with. Another key one here, I think it gets lost, but consult with your workers. This is another one of my points I'm going to keep on re-mentioning, my scratch record, particularly the workers you may not have thought about. So your volunteers and front of house staff who deal with visitors on a day-to-day basis. I know a number of them may be furloughed at the moment. You yourselves may be furloughed as well, as we said, but they are a mine of information about how visitors respond in a space and also how they may respond to future messages. So I think good engagement with your front of house staff and volunteers is really important, and I'd encourage you to be doing that as early in the process as you can, because I think, one, it's to get their input and insight, and ultimately you need them on board to deliver whatever the strategies are you want to put in place. And also share the results of your risk assessment. So whether it's as straightforward as giving them all the detail, but particularly or maybe on your website and some users, talk about how you're responding to some of these challenges. Acknowledge that you're identifying them, particularly with your workforce. Let them know that these are the challenges you're thinking about. Don't just tell them solutions. Let them know the problems you're trying to address. And equally, and like I said before, give them the opportunity to feed into this process as well. By the way, this one's quite text heavy, this part of the session. We'll try and move from that later on as we get into some of the other sessions. So it won't just be me talking over PowerPoint. Develop cleaning, hand washing, hygiene procedures. A number of you were thinking about these before it started. I'm not going to go through all of these. We're going to talk about cleaning in detail tomorrow. But equally, some really good high-level guidance. This is also, think about the messaging that you want to give to your potential visitors. If what they have been experiencing is the central government advice, aligning your messaging to that central government advice is quite a good way to get the message across clearly, rather than trying to develop something completely bespoke. And also talk about your, I hate to use the word defence, but if there was to be any challenge at a future point, as aligned as you've been to government guidance, gives you as much protection as you possibly can for any future challenge. Helping people to work from home. So obviously this is thinking about during lockdown, and I know a number of you think about reopening and bringing people back, but I know a number of institutions that are looking at the success of some of their remote working and asking one of the questions, do you need to bring everybody back? Just because you're going to reopen, we talk about the new normal. Does the new normal mean all of your staff coming back in? Can they work in different ways? Are there other ways to continue? And we talk about this being the new normal and also preparing for what we don't want to happen, but is a possibility of a second spike and further lockdown restrictions, making sure those measures are tailored and working. For a number of people who I know who are working for commercial organisations in the city, they're being told they won't go back into their offices until the new year at the earliest. So there's a real kind of a sea change in how people are working and how they're using their spaces. So it's something I'd encourage you all to look about. Maintain 2 metre social distancing. We all know this. Obviously, they talk about marking and painting areas. One thing I would say, and I'm sure you've all thought about it, if you have historic fabric, think very carefully about the markings you're putting down on the floor. Think about what adhesives you're using, your signage. Don't forget just for a bit of short-term solution, don't forget your care of the collection and of the building fabric. And also as well, thinking about these solutions not just being for day one. These may need to be solutions that may want to be in place for 18 months, if not longer. Does the signage look good? Is it something that's sustainable? Is it going to work? Are the stickers still going to be on the ground? And also, this is a real key one to keep an eye on. There's a significant amount of lobbying going on in central government at the moment. We are at 2 metre social distancing. We are one of the most restrictive countries globally. Many in Europe have moved down to 1.5 metres. The World Health Organization is at 1. I know this is something the UK government they're reluctant to change, but they are thinking about, because they know for a number of businesses moving from a 2 to 1.5 to 1 metre would make a big difference to how they operate. So you've got to work to 2 metres at the moment. However, in your planning, think that there is a very high chance that it could move to a lower number at some point in the near future, but don't expect it in the coming weeks, maybe months. And then I think this is a really important one, actually. This is the 5th point here. So where people cannot be 2 metres apart, manage transmission risk. So government are acknowledging that it's not always possible to keep everybody 2 meters apart. They're particularly thinking about workplaces here. So this is more kind of gauged at your staff rather than visitors. But just think around this. I know Libby will cover this tomorrow, but we're thinking things like manual handling of objects. Is there a risk actually by trying to force the 2 meter distance? You could put more risk to the people and their mechanisms for manual handling or the object itself. So you need to think about all of these. But I think it's just worth putting in. There is some scope for tolerance and understanding. And like I said before, if there are scenarios where you're not 2 meters, this comes back to the risk assessment tool. This comes back to if you decide that it's acceptable or there's going to be certain pinch points that you think there's other ways to manage it rather than the physical 2 meter distancing, I'd encourage you to document that and make sure you're very clear if you're not doing that. I'm not advocating you don't maintain 2 meter social distancing. I'm just saying you may need to think about this particularly. And I know, for example, looking at other sectors around staff working 2 meters apart, where they can't be maintained 2 meters apart, they're thinking of other mechanisms like operating teams in bubbles. So only one team works together at any one point in time, and minimizing the risk in other ways as well. So that's a really important one. This is so me just rapidly going through a number of these. I thought it was worth just running through really quickly some of the retail guidance. So as you all know, retail is open already, and non-essential retail opens from the 15th, I think it is. So guidance has been published on retail, and I think actually if you look at this is probably quite a good indication of if there is to be any more central guidance from government on museums and cultural spaces. It would probably look a lot like this. When you strip it back, a retail environment is not massively dissimilar to some museum environments. So it's worth just quickly running through this. And effectively, this is the government said, the high-level objective of all this is to minimise the contact resulting from visits to stores and outlets. So that's their kind of focus, and they're talking about minimising. They're not saying they can remove it, but they are minimising, and this is what you should think about in your planning. So defining the number of customers that can reasonably follow 2 meter social distancing. So this is about modelling within your spaces how many people can be in there. So again, unlike other countries where they've been quite explicit and said your capacity can only be 25% of your maximum capacity, where what you're going to expect to see here is more than putting the onus on you to model what that capacity can be. And one piece I'd always encourage you, when you're modelling that capacity, don't forget that your staff also have to operate within that space. So don't forget your staff in the. I've seen some modelling, and I've asked the question and said, well, how do front of house staff operate within this space and maintain 2 meter social distancing? That has to be considered as well. Overall limiting of number of customers. So again, applying this to museum setting, as we're already seeing, this is pre-booked tickets only. It's managing people on the front door. It's people queuing outside, so physically controlling the number of people in the building. Encouraging customers to use hand sanitizer, which is what we're doing before. And by the way, there's quite a bit coming on the chat. I'm going to look at the slides at the moment, so please do chat with yourselves, and I think it's quite useful feedback going between individual people, so do ask questions on there as well. Encourage customers to avoid handling products while browsing, and again, encourage. They're not saying don't, particularly those who at shops. They're saying just consider encouraging them. So this may be more around behaviours. I've been talking with a lot of mechanical, electrical contractors, those who do building maintenance, facilities management recently. And the overall feeling is, although there are potentially solutions that look at air filtration and cleaning, behaviour is going to be the one big thing that actually limits the interaction and transmission of the virus. And you can do something about the behaviour of your staff through training, through development, through engagement. People make their own choices. But you can also work with your visitors. And this is about clear, encouraging signage. It's not overwhelming them with signage. It's about thinking about how you communicate this message to them, thinking about that communication before they come to site. For example, if they book a ticket online, are you explaining to them how the site will feel different, what your expectations are of them as a visitor? Because another flag I'm going to wave here, and one of my real concerns is, with all these measures coming into place, is the expectation that front of house staff are going to have to police this. And is there a real risk of kind of conflict there for your front of house staff who may be having to intervene and manage and maintain social distancing? So you really need to think about your approach for front of house operations. Are you letting visitors into the space and then trusting them, or are your staff prepared to intervene? And if they are prepared to intervene, everybody, I think all of you who've been out in public understand that everyone has a slightly different risk perception around COVID-19 and transmission. Some people are masked up, maintaining distance. Some people will walk straight past you on the street. That's going to be the same in a museum environment. but that is a potential source of conflict between visitors and also with your staff. So really do think about that. Suspending services that can't be delivered. So as we look at the trackers later, some sites are reopening and they're just not opening areas that they can't police properly. So opening initially without cafes open, without shops open. Encouraging people to shop alone, probably not quite the thing for a museum visit, but equally thinking it's not just about social distancing individuals. You may have family groups or household groups who can be together. Again, that creates another real issue for your front of house staff. How do they differentiate between these? Reminding customers who are accompanied by children, they're responsible for supervising them. There's a real risk here, actually. I think we're going to have a whole generation of children who are going to, they're being told off the whole time for kind of not social distancing or not, but you also have to think about all of your visitors. So how do you think about that messaging with your visitors about making sure that the children they keep those children, I hate to use the word managed, but they are looking after them in a suitable way, a really complex issue. Looking at routes through the shops. I know many of you would have seen these one-way routes around museums. We're going to touch on that later. Think about queue management, entries, exits. So this is about design and layout of your buildings. Can you think about routes around the buildings? Are there entrances you're not currently using that you may want to bring into play? Physical changes generally come with a cost as well. So this is something that, unfortunately, a number of these, and this is why it's going to be a challenge for so many of us, are actually going to involve expenditure at this point in time. Using outside premises for queuing, we've seen people in car parks, managing queues as well. So just because they're outside your building, do you have a responsibility, even if they're not on your land, to manage that queue? I think there'll probably be an expectation, even if there isn't a requirement. Work with local authority landlords. So many of you exist in buildings that are you're either there as a tenant or you're in multi-tenanted sites. Think about engaging with everybody else who's within that. So I'm going through these fairly quickly. So all of these talk around working with other organisations who are close by. If you've got other businesses close by, how can you manage that? For example, queue management. If you're closely located to other businesses, is there something you can do together? Can you help each other? I think it's something to think about, and make sure you don't create demand as well. We're getting to the end of this one, by the way. These are the last two. Avoid sharing vehicles except with family. So maybe that's not such an issue, but some of you will have vehicles for your work, particularly if you have multi-site operations. So think about how you use those vehicles, particularly. A number of you are based in London, so maybe a lot of people use public transport, but obviously car parking, and think about that messaging as well. And continue to keep customer restaurants and cafes closed until further notice. So although there are takeaway offers in place, maybe this will have changed by the time that we reopen. I have actually seen examples in the UK of a couple of museum cafes who the museum isn't open, but they're offering takeaway services because their cafe is externally facing. An interesting one about bringing revenues in as well. It said, have a quick look at the comments that are running through. It said the guidance from NMDC suggesting that most museums will operate 25 to 30% capacity. That's broadly the kind of numbers, that's the expectation. But like I say, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, particularly on the size of the site. A lot of the NMDC data is particularly looking at the large nationals. I know these are large gallery spaces. It's easier to work out those capacities. They're much more to do with volume. Many of you work on smaller sites, and it's the same as doing a fire risk assessment. So often it's going to be the pinch points in the building that create the real issue rather than the big open spaces. So you need to be thinking about those as well. So just keep on time. So there's some really good advice out there. A lot of these, so Association of Independent Museums, ICON, Museum Association, there's a whole list of other ones we could put out there. What most of them are doing, they're kind of linking to other advice and guidance. But I think they're really good places to start. So I'm not assuming, some of you are right at the beginning of this journey. So if you haven't done this, I think the AIM one actually is really good. They seem to be linking through and posting quite a bit of data on there. Social media feeds for a number of these are pushing out some really interesting data, and particularly in a rapidly changing situation, the data and guidance is changing as well. So there's some really good data out there. And by the way, if any of you know of any really good data sources, please feel free to share them in the chat with everybody else if you found something really useful. These are just some that we're using to illustrate the point. You probably don't want me to go through a long list of what they all could be. So it's already been talked about in the chat here, the NMDC-led cross-sectoral working group. So I think it involves, I think Arts Council England involved, I think Museums Association, I think others are involved. So they're going to be publishing a set of guidance. I haven't actually cited this yet. So I'm quite hopeful that it's going to be setting out some good operational guidance about how we can get the sites back up and running. One of the benefits benefits, let's talk about it as a silver lining to the cloud we have, is the UK is probably one of the last countries in the world to be reopening its museums and galleries. We have a great opportunity to learn from colleagues and peers around the world, and I'm hoping that the NMDC guidance is also going to incorporate some of that lessons learned and best practice as well. So keep an eye out on that one. It will be coming out fairly shortly, and I'm sure it'll be widely circulated. And also, just within GCMS, they're talking about this Cultural Renewal Task Force. It was set up a few weeks ago. I haven't actually heard much from it. There's a lot of task force and working groups going on. I think the NMDC guidance is probably going to be something more specific, but just to let the GCMS and others are working on solutions as we go through. So summary on this section, we've rattled through the government guidance there, but hopefully I've just pulled out a few points and things that maybe you haven't thought about. There are many sources of guidance. However, your planning must be based on local risk assessments. I should just probably tattoo that on my forehead, and if we read it, it'd probably be easier because I keep saying that. Guidance from other sectors can and will be applied into museum settings. So if you look at the reopening plan for the UK, museums and galleries are relatively late on. So I think a lot of the guidance, there's only so many ways to skin a cat, I think will be applied to a museum setting. So keep an eye on those, and particularly around retail and others, it's worth looking for those. And then NMDC guidance is due mid-June. We've been getting the data the 19th of June as well, so kind of keep an eye on that as well. So hopefully that, I'm running through so many of these just to set the scene as we start to then think about identifying some key challenges. So this next bit gives me a chance to take a little break and breath. So normally I'd have you all in groups around tables if we were doing this session, but we can use the chat function. You can input if you want. And I just want you to, this is from the Silesian Museum, I think Poland. Look at this picture here. So just really quickly, Erica said there's a kite mark museums can use to show visitors. I think there's a kite mark being developed for, and they're not called a kite mark, for visitor attractions generally, that they're talking about. So Alva are pushing this forward. I know it's been worked at the moment, and they're hoping there will be a kite mark for the museums there, so therefore you can be undertake a submission and then get a kite mark that you can then display to show that you are a safe site, inverted commas. So yes, there is one out there, and I think Alva are leading the way on this one. So as a quick exercise, have a look at this picture and tell me what you think are the potential challenges. This is obviously a pre-COVID, so I'm not, there's no aspersions, this is not a live picture, this is pre-COVID. What are the challenges that you see in this picture that would have to be addressed? Just have a few of you can put some in. And thanks, George has put a link on there to the kite mark work. If anyone see that? And by the way, I put this photo up because I think it's fairly typical of a ticket desk, maybe something that you'd have on a different scale and everything else. Coming through, so people saying social distancing, staff members close together, there's touch screens. And so also as well, so if you want to start to have a think about what some of the solutions might be for this, or how you think this may change if it was a post. Yeah, obviously someone's talking about small historical, but I know a number of you are in very small sites. This is obviously taken from a much larger site, but if this was to be in a historic building or a small museum, it's in itself could be in a very confined area. Yeah, so someone's picked on signage. I noticed, I think particularly with the signage, thinking about this, that in order to read that signage, you'd have to go right up to the desk to read the signage. So automatically you're bringing people into contact with your front of house staff when they might not necessarily need to. So I think that's worth thinking about. So you're highlighting some of the things that we are seeing already. So the things that are on that list there. Also PPE for staff. So the PPE, we'll cover it tomorrow, is a really interesting one. Face masks, face visors, perspex screens. What does that look like? Also, if you have historic fabric, that adds its own challenges. And so what the solution could be. So yeah, this is just a bit of a warm up to get everybody thinking about some of these. So yeah, queuing systems, labeling on the floors, removal of touch screens. So a lot of technology has been introduced into spaces in the past 5 to 10 years that actually encourages physical contact that may have to be removed. Contactless payment. And also just think about the physical layout of the space. Like I said, the signage, maybe you want to bring the signage away from the ticket desk so you can review the signage before you get close. Also thinking about tickets. Do you want people buying tickets on site? How much of that could be automated and remote so they don't even need to go up to a ticket desk when they attend site? So a good one there. So this is kind of getting all your grey matter ticking over. This one here, interesting one, Cloak Room. What do people think the potential challenges are with this? And I know a number of you are looking at this and going, if only we had a cloakroom that was that big. Yeah, so someone's got, Tish, thanks for that one. You've got the real obvious one, which is physical contact, all these items of clothing that are potentially infected. Belongings, people close together. So again, the queuing thing, bringing people apart. So we'll come up to this internationally as we look. Payment as well, another one, is actually for a number of institutions, they just haven't opened their cloakrooms. So they've closed them. But then what impact does that have on the visitor experience? And if you've got visitors walking around with bags, coats, other things as well. So I know there's some guidance from a New Zealand museum, and they're actually encouraging visitors to only bring light jackets, to think about what they're bringing before they even come to site, to make it really clear that there isn't a cloakroom. Talk about screens there. I think the big challenge here and why you're not seeing cloakrooms open in a number of institutions is the physical contact of those objects and the risk of the contagion moving between visitors and staff. It's another one from the Rijksmuseum. It's one of their cafes. Again, to have a quick think, what are the issues in this scenario as we see it standing? Seating, obviously, yeah, that doesn't look particularly socially distanced. Sure, thanks for that. Narrow entrance, payment, social distance, the entry and exit being the same, I think is a real key one. I think there's two issues I think often see with cafes, and particularly if you've got limited space, there may only be one entry and one exit into that space. How do you manage that? And equally, then does that management involve front of house staff outside managing through? Also, as well, many shops and cafes are designed to encourage visitors to pass through them, particularly shops. There's a route there, but you're automatically then at that point you're forcing visitors through a space and creating congestion when there might not necessarily need to be. So you may need to think about visitor routes, but then what impact does that have on your commercial strategy as well? Cafe on stairs, lots of passing traffic. So this image feels like it's a through route as well as just a cafe as well. Yeah, so Marie, you mentioned the Rijksmuseum. They've actually some really good videos for the Rijksmuseum. I would encourage you to go and have a look there about the measures they put in place. We're going to use an example, not from the Rijksmuseum, but from another museum, because I think it's really important to learn from here. So an issue, so maybe when you look at a challenging situation like this, you could put an awful lot of effort into developing measures, control that will be quite costly. Some institutions will be forced down a route to say, well, actually, we just can't reopen these spaces. We're going to look at the cafes tomorrow, amongst others, and look at what some of the potential solutions are around this. What about this one? So I think this is, the link's gone over. I think this appears to be the British Museum, so unsurprisingly. You can type it if you want. I think it's probably fairly evident what the main challenges are with this particular one. Andrew, I think you're saying what we're all thinking. Crowding, yeah, space. So some of the issues with this one is obviously the physical crowd itself. There's one about, and this comes down more to exhibition display, is the interpretation really close to the object? Is it quite small? Do you need to get close in to see both the interpretation and the object? So small signage and labeling. So is there an opportunity to distance labeling from the object itself? What I see here as well, that we're all looking for silver linings in this cloud and sustainable solutions. If I look at a solution like this, and if you could come up with a socially distanced solution, I think this is probably the Rosetta Stone. I can't from that angle. Could those socially distanced solutions actually improve the visitor experience? So for any of you who've been to the BM or somewhere similar, is actually a change in social distancing and some measures around that beneficial to the visitor experience? Are there some opportunities within all this that actually, particularly when you have star objects and objects that everybody wants to see, more management around social distancing could actually be really beneficial? So I think there are some real key things. And there's a point being made about blockbuster exhibitions. So a lot of discussion at the moment of going, yeah, will blockbuster exhibitions even exist going forward? Bringing large numbers of people into quite crowded spaces and creating that atmosphere of this really kind of dense, object-rich experience that you pay for. Does that still work in a restricted world? Do the models make sense? I think it's going to be a big change in what we're doing. So another one here, I put this one up particularly. I've looked for international examples rather than putting anyone up. This is the Uffizi, or part of it here. So this is just a restricted historic building. So what do we think may be the key challenges? I know a number of you are working within these. If you were looking to reopen this space, yeah, safe route, traffic flow. So this is one of the key ones with this this site is how do you create a one-way route in quite constrained spaces? Maybe some of you have some quite large sites and large galleries and you can implement routes. If your building is a number of small rooms, often with those rooms being with one way in and one way out. So some of the measures you may be having to implement, and we're seeing implemented elsewhere, is some rooms will just have to be closed off. You need to think about that. In order to get the building open, you may not be able to open the entire site. Because the alternative to managing that is having a member of front of house staff managing people in and out of that space. Is that even achievable? 2 meters is quite a big space. How do you actually maintain, these are small rooms, how do you physically keep people 2 meters apart? So yeah, it'd be interesting to see more of the solution. And then limiting number, sorry, I've gone back there. Limiting number of people in rooms. So, and there's only one toilet on the roof as well. Yeah, I think that's, so we always come back to toilets, and often as well, toilets tend to be located in slightly out of the way and in very small spaces. So even access to the toilets, they're often down a corridor. How you maintain social distancing to even get to the toilet in the first place, let alone manage social distancing in the toilet, is something we're going to put on tomorrow. So it's really interesting one. They said George is saying that some supermarkets aren't doing one-way systems. I think a supermarket is probably a really good. It's almost the counter analogy that from what we're seeing, all they're showing that the queuing really works outside of a lot of supermarkets, and then when you get inside, it's a bit of a free for all. And I think there's a really interesting analogy there between front of house staff and supermarket staff. So my personal experiences are in the supermarket, the staff aren't looking to actively police social distancing; they're leaving it to the visitors. Do you want to think about the same thing, but in your institutions, or do you think your visitors will have a different expectation that your staff will have to manage it in slightly different ways? So I think, yeah, the supermarket one. My thoughts are they probably should be operating one-way systems, but then as all these, it comes down to policing and have you got the staff and the resource to do this, or do you trust your visitors? I think the answer is going to lie somewhere in between. I think communicate with your visitors, get good messaging out there, encourage good behaviours, and using your staff to intervene when they have to. Would it be seen as a negative for a museum to decide not to reopen until social distancing is lifting? I think that's a really interesting question. I think the benefit will be the precedent set by the nationals. So from the data I've seen, and I won't go into explicit detail, some of the nationals, particularly a large gallery somewhere near Trafalgar Square, is looking to open fairly early on. I think others are looking to phase their opening over the rest of the summer. So some of them, you won't see them fully opening their sites until the autumn. Particularly some of the multi-sites. I think the majority of the large nationals, it would probably be August that you'll see significant reopening of the large national institutions. And even then, that's with limitations internally. So therefore, if you didn't open on day one, I don't think it's necessarily seen as a negative, but other people may have a view on that. I think in the early days of opening, you're going to be very reliant on your very loyal visitors, your members, however you're structured anyway, and I think they'll be quite sympathetic. I think if you get the messaging right, actually, if you focus on the fact you're trying to make it as safe as possible for your staff and visitors, I think people will get that and understand that. And also understanding that economically, it has to make sense. That there's no point you fully staffing an institution, particularly while furlough is still applying, if you're going to have one visitor in the building on that day. It just doesn't make sense. So I think people need to understand that. So engagement with your members, with your visitors, is really important just to manage those expectations. So I think but like I said, the precedent from the Nationals is don't expect all of those to be open. They're going to be phasing over several months. So if you're not open day one, I don't think it's going to be that unusual. The purpose of the second session this afternoon is to look at case studies. So this afternoon we're going to start by talking about the Museum of London. We're going to look at some other case studies. We're going to look at how the reopening around the world is informing what we're doing here in the UK and what we can learn. So we've talked in the first session around the guidance, very high level, what that's telling us to do. This afternoon is around, well, what can we learn from other people? And then tomorrow is going to be very much focusing on individual subject areas. So this afternoon is kind of the big picture, some of the trends, some really interesting examples. But that's what we do this afternoon. So Steve, I'm going to hand over to you. We've got 20 minutes. So we said we're going to keep this a fairly informal, so really grateful Stephen's given time this afternoon. I think you're just going to give a bit of an overview of probably more where you are on the journey rather than what the solutions are that you have planned, I think is probably the right way to put it. Just so you know, Stephen, and I may interject, we've got the chat function running. I don't know if you can see that. We've said that people can ask questions, so either I'll pick up on those or if you want to pick up on them, more than happy for you to do that. But I'm going to hand over to you. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. So yes, as Ben said, I'm Stephen Dollamore. I'm Head of Visitor Experience and Security at the Museum of London. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the museum, we have 3 sites. The main site at London Wall, which is part of the Barbican estate in the City of London. Then we have our site at Docklands, which is next to Canary Wharf. And we also have a storage facility in Hackney in East London. And I think all of those different venues present different challenges in this process. And I can perhaps talk about some of those differences as we go along. And also, as Ben said, I think we're very much still on our journey. And don't profess to have all the answers, and I'm more than happy to hear other people's ideas and questions as well. I very much hope this can be a conversation as we go along. So as I say, we've got the 3 sites. The museum closed to the public on the 18th of March, and that was all 3 sites closed on the same day. We have furloughed the vast majority of our front of house team. Normally the team is about 60 across certainly the main 2 sites. And at the moment there are 5 of us. So yes, obviously reduced numbers. We have been very conscious of the need to still maintain contact with the staff who are on furlough. So people are regularly contacted. We don't talk about work, obviously, but just as a way of making sure that everyone is okay and checking in on them. And then obviously that will help us to bring people back as we get ready to reopen. Prior to closure, as events unfolded, we activated our business continuity team, which has representatives from obviously myself, front of house and security, but then also members of our facilities team, HR, finance, comms, and collections. And that has really proved invaluable as we've gone along, as a forum for decision making, and also exchanging ideas internally. I think one of the things that I'm sure everyone has found really helpful is speaking to peers. And with that mix of people, obviously that network is then much wider. And some of the things where there are crossover, our favourite subject, toilets, is something that the facilities team and ourselves are very, very linked on. Valuing our staff and making sure that they're well and supported. Obviously, HR have a huge role to play in that. The whole furloughing process they managed as well, and making sure that we're dealing with people in the right way and hitting the right mood. And I think on the whole we've managed that so far. As far as kind of sharing information is concerned, obviously we have our individual contacts, but there's also ALVA, which is the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions, which some of you may be aware of, and I know Ben's been involved supporting them. And also there's Visitor Experience Forum, which is predominantly centred on LinkedIn, which is a really useful resource. And they have agreement with ALVA to share the ALVA briefings on a daily basis. So even if you're not a member or your organisation isn't a member, if you join the VE forum, then you can get access to that information as well. I think obviously working closely with your local authority and what resources they may have that are available has been really helpful for us working with the city. City Corporation of London have a resilience group and obviously coordinating their response, and we as a kind of arm's length part of the city, we receive funding from them, we can tap into that, and that's been really helpful as well. And I think actually one of the things that it's benefited us is as we've moved on to planning for reopening is actually looking at what our neighbours are doing and trying to ensure that we have a consistency of approach. I think obviously everyone's spaces and perhaps audiences are slightly different, but giving our visitors the assurance that we're taking their safety and well-being seriously is really important, and that if they come to us, they're going to be looked after in a certain way, but also if they then go to St Paul's, for example, just down the road, that again there'll be certain standards and so on that they'll see. And that's also been quite helpful with looking at training. I think, as I say, we've got the majority of the team are on furlough, but we are definitely planning to bring them back in prior to reopening for training, both refresher training, as some of them haven't been in the building for a few months, but then also training to support them dealing with this new normal. Unfortunately, lots of the conversations that I've had around training have often focused or centred around the need for conflict management training. We're asking our staff obviously to be our eyes and ears on the galleries and to help us to help the public follow the guidelines. And I think, unfortunately, most people anticipate at some point that there may be some friction on that. So I think that's a really important area. We haven't done it yet, but one of the things that we'll be looking at, particularly with our front of house team, is sending a survey out to them, asking them how they're feeling, what their concerns are about returning, what equipment they feel they would benefit from. I think as well there's an opportunity to find out where people are travelling from and how they're travelling from to the buildings. That's my biggest concern is actually getting staff to the museum. And obviously TfL have been publishing quite a lot of advice for travelling lately. So we'll be following that and helping people to access that information as well as part of their return. I think, it's important, obviously, that visitors can travel to us, but actually, if we don't have people in, then we can't open the doors for them. So I think that's really key. Obviously, one of the things linked to that is risk assessing what we're doing. I think there's a feeling that potentially the risk assessments that we undertake may be actually published and available for the public to see. Certainly, I can see some being subjects of freedom of information requests, potentially. And also, I think sharing those with the staff. if there are things that we've missed that actually someone who is in the space so often picks up, then that's really useful. I think as well, part of the conversation, if you've got union presence in your organisations, is obviously to engage with them as well, and so that we're all, you know, pulling in the same direction. And again, if there are issues that we may not have recognised, that there's another, you know, more potential for those to be flagged. I think that we will be looking at PPE like everybody else. I think one of the other issues that we're going to find is not only travel, but actually procuring whatever PPE we feel that we should be supplying as, you know, a result of those risk assessments. And that's principally, our thinking at the moment is principally that that's for staff rather than visitors. So yeah, I think there's a global shortage of perspex at the moment. So we're looking at screening at certain points, so till points and information points, and getting those in and fixed in place and so on. I think will be that, actually, I think will be something that has quite an influence on our timeline back to public opening. I mean, some of the practical things that we're looking at doing, which I'm sure, you know, most places are either considering or already have in place that have opened, we will be using a ticketed entry. We don't normally, we still won't be charging, we're free to enter. We're basing our overall capacity on 30% of what our normal budgeted numbers would be. My team, the team that are left, have done a lot of planning, both on plans of routes around the galleries. And then actually last week we went to both Docklands and to the London Wall and actually started at the front door and walked through the routes to make sure that what appeared to work on paper does. And I'm happy to say that on the whole it has done. One of the things we've been quite strict with ourselves when we're doing that is trying to minimise, wherever possible, cul-de-sacs or dead ends. So there have been a couple of quite big corners of galleries that we've decided we're not going to open at the moment, so that we can maintain that flow. And then there are a couple of galleries, certainly at London Wall, where it's one door into a gallery. So those will certainly at the start be closed. And I think, you know, I touched on earlier, toilets, and I know that everyone is trying to work out toilets. The layout of our buildings, Docklands, although is more challenging in the galleries and certainly moving around the space, it's a converted warehouse and relies a lot on lifts and one stairway. Actually, the rest of the facility is much more accessible and more open. So I think we can manage those easier than that London Wall, where effectively we're going to have to manage a corridor which the loos come off and is also the staff entrance to the offices. So I think something else that we're going to need to work on is how those staff that are coming in, how they enter the buildings. And I think that's one area where we're going to be quite, you know, very present and managing that. I'm hoping that we can, by doing that management, we'll, you know, be able to use all of the loos and make them unisex effectively, as we can then, we'll be, you know, guiding people to and from the facilities. Some of that's still got to be walked through, so we'll see. I think the other thing is to say is that we're looking at reducing our opening hours certain parts of the week, partly because I think that's more sustainable financially, but also we will then not need to, reduce the number of staff that we bring in. So if we do a four-hour opening, we then would run straight through without breaks or lunch breaks, and we then don't need to provide those facilities, and less people are needed to run the operation. I think that's most likely to be during the week, and then at the moment our plan is that we would open as normal Saturdays and Sundays. But again, I think that all of this is up for review once we get going, and once we're closer to the date, whatever it may be, that we open. We've looked at cafes. We're quite lucky that we have options for cafe spaces at both of the public sites. So we got 2 at London Wall, one which is quite small, so we're going to not open that. And fortunately, the larger space is more open, so we can maintain social distancing more, but it also is effectively at the end of the one-way route around the galleries. So it's kind of finishing the visit there. Although that said, the commercial team is still evaluating whether there'll be an offer that people can actually consume on site, or whether it will be something that's takeaway. And also looking at linking that potentially with booking to access the buildings, so that you can book both your ticket into the building, but also potentially a packed lunch or something to take with you. I suspect that we have 2 different cafe operators, and one at each site. They may well have a different different approaches, but I think we would certainly ask them to be more understanding of people bringing their own food and using the cafe to consume it. Retail, we're looking at a much reduced retail offer, and again potentially click and collect, so something that's online that people can either book pre-visit and pick up, or else obviously once they've been round they can buy something online to have it delivered. One of the other things that I think is quite an interesting conversation, as I say, most places is going down the ticketed route. What do you do if someone turns up who hasn't booked? Obviously it goes against all our instincts to not welcome someone in. But I suspect that certainly at the beginning we will be quite strict on that. Even if that means someone has to go down the road and get their phone out and book on their phone, I think, to monitor numbers and to make sure that we can maintain a nice flow through the building, we will be asking people to do that. I think that we will be, obviously, like everyone else, we're looking at signage and messaging. There are opportunities there to make it interesting, to brand it, and not just have hazard tape everywhere. I think that's really important. Pre-visit messaging when people book will be really key as well. There's some really good examples of that messaging out there at the moment. Lots of places have started to produce videos explaining their kind of terms of entry. So that's something that obviously is quite resource. You need some resource to do it well, but it makes it very clear. So I think that's something we would look at. But yes, as I say, I think there are opportunities within that to be positive and to kind of push your brand out. I think messaging is going to be very important, and how your messaging reflects and fits in with those around you. So I think at the moment, for example, City of London is very much, we're open, but we don't actually want many people to come because we don't want to overcrowd the area. So how does that work with somewhere that perhaps relies more on so much commercial income? But I think there's positives that we can do. We know that the overseas market's not going to be with us this summer, or it's very unlikely. So I think there's messages there about it's a chance for, you know, Londoners to actually come and visit areas and places in London they wouldn't do because they're so busy normally. And again, that would, for us, reduce the amount of travel time potentially that people would need to make. As I say, I think supporting staff is going to be most important. I think it's going to be a very difficult period. You know, we are still, like many others, still telling staff who don't have to come in not to come in, and I think there's the potential there for quite a big disconnect between, you know, front of house and back of house. We've had a security and facilities presence on the site throughout, and I think, you know, we've been very conscious of speaking to them and making sure that they you know, that our appreciation of what they're doing is known to them. As I say, one of the things we will certainly be focusing on training. We are currently looking at some training for mental health first aiders. I think, as I say, this is going to be a very difficult period. We're asking them to come and use potentially public transport, to work with the public in an environment. We need to make the environment safe, but I think there will still be a lot of anxiety in the team. So, you know, making them feel as comfortable as they can is obviously the first step to then them making our visitors feel comfortable. So,
Steve, sorry.
No,
it's my time. That's all. Those are all fantastic, really useful insights. And there was a few questions coming through. We've got a couple of minutes, so I just wanted to pick up. So there are a few comments there around, particularly around the ticketing and about kind of computer literacy. And I think on a number of measures, people are quite concerned by implementing measures that maybe dissuade or preclude certain people from visiting. So I think, and I know you could have mentioned that you talked about a member of staff, I think slightly flippantly, could have gone down the road with their iPhone. But are there other solutions you're thinking about that for those non-computer literate people, if they do turn up and they want to get a ticket, or other ways of booking?
I mean, I think, you know, the point was made in the chat about potentially having a small amount of tickets available for walk-ups, if you like. Yeah. So I think that's something we could definitely look at. But I think at the moment that reducing the amount of interaction and also the kind of knowing how many, you know, the numbers that we're going to expect on any given day are probably at the moment a priority. And I think that's something as time goes on, we can look at ways of loosening that.
And I'm sure this is probably a bigger change for the Museum of London than some other sites, because normally you don't have tickets, and normally it's quite free flowing. So I'm assuming there's potentially additional resource that you're having to put forward in terms of managing that you wouldn't normally have in place, because people don't normally have to buy a ticket.
No, that's right. I mean, we have kind of exhibitions that are ticketed and ticketed events, but, you know, it will be very much where we can, where people are able to pre-visit. We haven't made the decision entirely, but I suspect we will go cashless. So again, I think it's about, you know, minimising that interaction, but still providing the experience that's worth coming to. And I think, you know, like, that's something that we're all going to have to try and balance over the next 6 months. Is creating somewhere that's safe and welcoming at the same time. One of the things that we're looking at potentially, we are expecting not to have PPE as mandatory, but that it will be available if staff want to use it. And we're looking at the clear visors rather than mouth coverings, because it will help, you know, people will be able to see the person that's saying hello. And, you know, there's obviously, if we have visitors who lip read, then that will facilitate that. So trying to be open and welcoming, as I say, but balancing the need to, you know, protect our teams.
Great. That was really good, Steve.
Uh,
So, no, we've got a fair amount of, but that's really useful. There's a few questions on there that we haven't quite come to. Steve, if it's okay with you, if there's any further questions come through, are you okay that I pass them over and then maybe I can share the responses back with the
yeah,
participants?
absolutely. Yes, yeah, of course.
By the way, yeah, I think there was one I really I quite liked. Just one of the comments that came out of you there, and I think it goes to your point, Stephen, about the queuing and about whether kind of make it more playful or slightly different because you're a museum. And I think this is, although we talked a lot in the first half about kind of comparisons to retail environments, museums aren't shops, so it's kind of how do we deliver all of these changes in a way that reflects the character and the personality of the organisation. So how can it feel different, and how can it be enjoyable and educational, and what can be done around those? So I think that's a really interesting point. So.
Yeah, and I think, and different, different museums have different kind of different tones.
Yep.
Somewhere, so some of the perhaps South Kensington museums, for example, speak in a very different way to their audiences than like we do. And I think our communications team are really keen to be, not to be too kind of dour and doomy and gloomy. Obviously, there are serious points and messages that we need to get across, but at the same time, Museum of London has quite a light tone, and we do humour. So I think where we can incorporate that, absolutely. And yeah, so I just seen the chat popping up, the comment about sanitising the building and not the experience. I think that's really, really crucial. And I think getting that right, that will then, I think, in years to come, how we respond to this will influence whether people come back, to us and repeat visitors.
And we talked about this earlier in the session. There's a risk, actually, you could do some damage to the long-term brand by doing this in the wrong way.
No, absolutely. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons why, I was saying, I think before most people had come back from getting tea, we've got a kind of 8-week period that we think we'll need to get back to reopening. But actually, if in week 6, it looks like we're going to need another 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, we will do that. Because, we want to get it as right as we can.
Stephen, thank you for your time. Sorry, we probably could have talked for an awful lot longer. So really appreciate it. You're welcome to stay, by the way.
I've got a meeting about reopening in a couple of minutes, so I'm going to have to go. But I mean, yes, as you say, if there are other questions, by all means, pass them on, and I can send responses back. And
hopefully as well, that was really reassuring for a lot of people to hear that the Museum of London is a relatively large institution, but they're dealing with exactly the same challenges that everyone else is, that they're on the journey. That I think Stephen very honestly said that they don't have all the answers at the moment, and I don't think anyone does. And this is part of what we're going through at the moment, is there isn't one place we can all go to and get all those answers. We're all trying to find a way through this, and to listen to each other and share that best practice and what works and what doesn't, I think is going to be the secret to success over the coming months, years, is about how we figure that out. So. Fantastic. Thank you, Stephen.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Good luck.
Thanks.
Bye.
So I'm just going to go back to the slides. Hopefully you can all still hear me. So we just had a fantastic case study there from Stephen Dollimore, Head of Visitor Experience and Security at the Museum of London. So it was just really interesting to hear. And I think just kind of getting some of those practical insights as well. So I really hope that was useful. One we're going to do very quickly now, and this is where we're going to test to see the technology works. You may have already seen this video. It's one about the Auckland Museum, which opened, it was actually a few weeks ago. They were fairly early on. And it's about a 16-minute video. The link's there. But I'm just going to show you just 3 or 4 minutes of this video, because I think it's a really interesting walkthrough of how a site feels like that has opened, and this is one of the opportunities to do this. So bear with me for 30 seconds while I'm going to attempt to make the technology work, and this is either going to be an outstanding success or it's not going to work at all. So let's see if we can make the technology work. Okay. Oh, if I share the right screen, that would be more helpful. See, this is where all the gloss falls off this as I struggle with the technology. So I'm going to try and move this to full screen. Hopefully you can see that. Thumbs up, anyone? If you can see that, yeah. and then hopefully you can hear it
All
as well.
visitors coming into the museum have to register first using the Next Up system by sending
Can you all hear?
a
Let me take your
SMS
heads if you
or
can't hear it.
using the
Okay.
website. This helps the museum with both capacity management and contact tracing, and provides the visitor with the extra benefit of measuring queue wait time. I've already registered, and this is the confirmation page. I'm going to show this QR code to the staff as I go in. One of the things that's been quite impressive about Auckland Museum is that they've paid a lot of attention to privacy. So on their website and also here on the QR code scanning area, they've provided a lot of information. Usually in this area we would see large ticketing desks, but because Auckland Museum has stopped ticketing due to the lack of foreign visitors in the country, instead they've replaced those large visitor desks with these QR code scanning pods. One of the benefits of registering with the Next Up system is that it also tells you the queue wait time for the line outside the museum. The museum have got some great advice on their website, especially about what to bring. For a start, they've said a light coat because the coat check is closed due to COVID-19. They also suggest bringing your own full water bottle because the drinking fountains are currently closed. The wheelchairs are still available, but they are being sanitised after every use. The museum is still doing a paper visitor guide as a wayfinding map around the museum. I'm going to start my visit with a coffee. Auckland Museum's cafe is the best. Here in the queuing area there's lots of really clear signage both on the ropes and on the floor. After each table is finished in the cafe, the staff are giving their area a very thorough clean, both tables and chairs. Auckland Museum for the first time is getting its visitors to go through the building in a very specific flow. So it means that areas like behind me are cordoned off so that visitors go through the right entrance to each area. The museum is using visual signals on the floor to indicate to visitors which way to go through the building. Because this area contains taonga or treasures, it is considered tapu or sacred, and usually visitors would wash their hands here before they leave to wash off that tapu. But this area has been closed, but the museum has done a really beautiful job. We can see some of the signage that was up from before the museum closed in foreign languages, where it was encouraging tourists to obey the Ministry of Health guidelines. In a city built on over 50 volcanoes, this is Auckland's favourite exhibit, but it is a high-touch area, and its eruption simulator crams people into a bedroom to imagine what an eruption looks like. So this area has been completely closed to the public. It's nice that the exhibit is still running though, so we can get a sense of what it would be like. There's heaps of cleaning happening all through the museum, very visible. Everyone who knows me knows I'm a major dino fan. Come and check it out. The museum has used their COVID-19 branded signage, not just for safety messages, but also to show their new wayfinding. Sue, if you're watching, found your friend. The museum has closed most of its touch exhibits and interactives, including digital. This space is a really interesting area.
So that was hopefully already, some of you may have seen that already from Auckland Museum. There's actually about a 15-minute video, and there's also a lot of examples globally around this. I personally found it really useful and interesting just to get a sense of what they feel like, what they do. Also, I know a number of museums are actually creating videos ahead of reopening, similar to this style. I think the Rijksmuseum did. I saw one of the Swiss Transport Museum, and they use it to publicise actually what the visitor journey will feel like. So it's part of the visitor experience and going, here's a 5-minute video saying, this is what it's going to feel like. We're going to expect this of you, make it clear that the cloak rooms aren't open, all of those kind of elements. So I think it's actually a really good opportunity here, potentially. As well as just being interesting to museum professionals, I think a lot of visitors. Also, understanding that a lot of these may have impacts on certain groups of visitors, particularly around accessibility. So some of those visitors are very keen to understand how the site will operate. So I'm going to go back to my favorite topic of museum toilets, but some people have very specific needs and types of facilities, so they need to know what kind of facilities are available, because without certain facilities, they may not be able to visit the site at all. Even things like, I think there's the image here on the screen about the water fountains not being available, so encouraging people to bring their own water. A number of these initiatives are kind of pushing back against certain sustainability initiatives that we've been pushing over recent years, so around rebottled water, reusable coffee cups, all those kind of things. So I think you need to think about how those are incorporated into your messaging as well. So lots of really good opportunities here. Just a little bit of a plug here, but there's a webinar that's being run under the banner of Museum Toilets next Tuesday. The links are on my social media feed. I mentioned this earlier, but we've got the Museum Disability Collaborative Network and Embed and others involved. And that's very much looking at museum toilets and other facilities about how they reopen and what impacts may be on accessibility, on signage. So you may pick up temporary signage. What's the impacts that have on all the visitors? So there's a free webinar next Tuesday at midday. I can always send the link around after this as well, which you'd be free to attend as well. So kind of keep an eye on that one. If we are going to touch on some of that tomorrow, by the way, but if you really want to spend 90 minutes really thinking about that, then that's what we're going to do. So what I'm going to do now is just run through a few really high-level case studies and then go on to look at what some of the broader trends are across the UK and globally as well, as we look to progress through with this. Obviously, we've got 25 minutes left of this session, so I'm going to go through. This is much to illustrate that, as some of you may be aware, parks, gardens are reopening, places like Kew Gardens, Wisley, visitor attractions that are outdoor spaces, but with a lot of parallels. They're worth looking at as they look to address some of these. And as we talked about, some of the larger sites will have a lot of parallels to your sites, particularly around toilet provision, cafes, how they're opening, and I'll go through some of the tracking data. So these are just kind of randomly selected almost, but just give it a bit of an insight into what's opening up. So somewhere like Kingston Lacey, National Trust property, but they are expecting visitors to book. That they have specific arrival times. You're also seeing this at places like Kew and Wisley. But they are still keeping the house, the shop, the cafe, the play area open. So there's a bit of a reassurance here and about setting public expectation that already from other sites that are open, they're going expecting that not everything will be open. So maybe this gives you some reassurance in terms of when you reopen. I still keep coming back to this messaging thing that Stephen also mentioned to make sure it's clear. Obviously, they're maintaining 2 meter social distancing. Increased signage. We'll talk about, it's come up a few times. So I think we're actually going to put a bit more content in for tomorrow, but around signage and how we don't just overwhelm visitors. And you saw in the Auckland video about consistency and branding of signage, and about that being part of the experience. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. So we'll try and cover that tomorrow as well in more detail. So I'm just going to rattle through some of these. So another example, we're looking globally, Houston Museum of Natural Science, obviously in the United States. So online booking recommended, but they are finding ways that you can turn up as well. So I think their preference is that you can book online. However, they are finding ways to allow, and I think it's a very front of house heavy, that you can kind of turn up and book a ticket effectively on site when you get there as well, or purchase a ticket. They're keeping galleries open, some exhibitions. They're managing to open their toilets and cafes and shops. Social distancing, so we're seeing internationally, in the States particularly, they talk a lot about percentage visitor capacity rather than maintaining the social distancing, and I think we're going to be talking more about maintaining the distance rather than overall capacity. One thing you're seeing internationally that we're not seeing so much in the UK is health checks, so things like temperature checks when you attend sites. Some Italian sites are doing this. It doesn't seem to be the norm, and it's not being rolled out in many other sectors in the UK, so we're not expecting those to come in. But again, individual institutions may take their own view on this, and things like, and they're providing face masks and gloves for visitors as well as their staff. That's quite potentially puts a financial burden on the organisation, but they feel it's necessary. Also, as well, around sustainability. It's worth thinking about the amount of potential plastic waste that's producing as well, which is another real challenge that I think is broader than the museum sector. Somebody's just put up, George, in the group chat saying that Legoland have announced temperature checks. So maybe, I don't know if, I'm assuming that's Legoland UK, I don't know if, or if that's Legoland Denmark or another, but there's an example being given there that it may come into play in some areas. UK is the things there. Royal Museum of Fine Arts Belgium, so they were relatively early to plan. I encourage you to go to their website. They've actually got some really detailed setting out of what their restrictions are that are in place and what aren't. Again, they're saying card payment only for booking. Question mark, does that restrict people who only operate in cash or don't have the right type of cards? They're not allowing any kind of group reservations, timed entry slots. So one thing I would say, you're seeing some clear themes and trends here. They're making lockers available. They're managing the total number of visitors into the building. They're putting temperature checks in place, providing face masks, light security checks on visitors. So security is a really interesting one, particularly if you're a site that operates bag checks. Bag checks are you're putting the security guards in physical contacts with the possessions of somebody who's coming to the building. So there's talk around lighted touch bag checks. Does that therefore change your security strategy for the building? Another interesting analogy is when the concern was pre-COVID and maybe more around terrorism, bag checks might not have been the most effective way to stop knives, explosive devices coming to the building, but they were primarily there to reassure visitors. Do we have other measures now? Are the cleaners being very, very visible? The kind of the 2020 equivalent of the bag check is about having very visible cleaners that then reassure your visitors in a similar way to the fact that the bag checks reassured that they were coming into a secure space. Maybe cleaners reassure them that they're coming to a clean and safe space. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about there on security checks. And we'll talk a bit more about security tomorrow. So I quite like this quote again from Peter Schneidel in the New Yorker. Here's a prediction of our experience when we are again free to wander museums. Everything in them will be other than what we remember. The objects won't have altered, but we will have in some ratio of good and ill. So it's expected the visitors, the staff will have changed. Our expectations of the spaces. So although our physical spaces may be the same, we're also our museums are places where people come to interact with each other and with the collections. And if those pieces have changed, if the people have changed, that may have altered the experience as well. Not necessarily something we have an answer for necessarily at this point, but I think something just to kind of keep in mind. As interestingly on the chat, a couple of people saying that temperature checks are norm in the US. I think Tish is saying there that look at temperature testing kits, but it's very expensive. So there's a number of suppliers. You guys may be bombarded by companies selling technology and the next best solution and video monitoring temperature checks and all these kind of pieces come in. I think it's something that's worth watching and ultimately a consideration of whether you'd be doing it to reassure visitors or whether you're actually doing it as a preventative measure to make the site safer. So it's part of your risk assessment, and I'd encourage you to put measures in place that make the building safer wherever possible. So just some international guidance as we kind of canter through this in the final minutes of today's session. So this is from the American Alliance of Museum. So I've completely abridged their advice, but it gives a sense of what's happening in America and some perfectly reasonable assessments to make here. Coordinate locally, so with authorities, other museums. I think Stephen said that they've been doing similar around Museum of London. Assess conditions, even when legally permitted to reopen, determine when you think it's safe to do so. A really good bit of advice. I think also it's a really important message for you all to be thinking about when you have other stakeholders involved, trustees, executive, other stakeholders who are very keen to reopen as soon as possible to get revenues back up. If you guys, you're joining this course because I'm assuming you've got some involvement in terms of the operations, you need to have the strength to potentially challenge back on some of these and go, look, we're not happy, we're not comfortable, we don't think it's the right time to do this, and we think there's very good reasons. And the risk assessment tools are really important for you to do that, so that full risk assessment. So think around that challenge. And also, as I said before, envisage a scenario that hopefully we're working with a downward trend in COVID cases, but there may be spikes and changes, and you may have to kind of alter this. So develop those risk assessments in a way that can respond to those as well. Fundamentally, prioritize health and safety. All the things that we've talked about. Obviously in the States, they picked up kind of cloth face covers as recommendation. We're in the UK, we're not seeing it in all environments, although the government advice now is for enclosed spaces and public transport, I believe. So we may see them becoming far more common than we have done up until now. So this is one from Australia, from Museum and Galleries in Queensland. Again, a lot of similar advice. Again, reiterating the message I said earlier, don't forget to take your staff into account when you're calculating. And a really important one, that's obviously come up, ensure that your signage is clear and easy to read using appropriate font size. So there's going to be a real desire to create some signage and put it up. We talk about accessibility. It needs to be visually clear. I think another is it's consistent. And what was really interesting, what Stephen said from Museum of London, is they've been coordinating with other visitor attractions like St Paul's Cathedral to try and, if they can, develop some consistency of approach between those. And ultimately, that's the point we want to get to. So visitors become comfortable and they understand what's going in. I quite like, I just put in the bottom right-hand corner. So this is the one they advocate using. I think it's quite a nice, simple piece of signage around social distancing. Keep it clean, keep it simple where you can, develop it yourself. We'll bring some case studies in tomorrow and some examples of signage to discuss, to see what people think, and to see if we can get that message out in a clear way to our visitors. But like I say, signage will be part of a programme of communicating with your visitors that would have begun hopefully beforehand through your website, through social media, through the ticketing as well. So from the case studies, again, you can go and find some of these. There's some great videos. I'd recommend the Auckland Museum one. The Rijksmuseum have done some really good videos about them reopening. It's worth it. You can just kind of Google, find those on YouTube. There's broad trends forming around social distancing and other key factors that we're seeing. So the challenges you've got will be unique to your site, but there's bigger ones like social distancing that are being applied elsewhere. So think about learning where you can from others. With only guidance in place, institutions are risk assessing at a local level and developing their own solutions. So even in countries that have opened up with relatively clear guidance, we're still seeing quite clear differentiators between different sites about how they open and them understanding their own sites. So ahead of reopening, in the same way that all your staff and volunteers, and make sure that they're comfortable and they can be part of the solutions as well. So I'm just making some time back up because we went through a bit of a longer one there. So lessons learned and key trends. I'm just going to use this last part of the session to look at what's going on globally. Some of you may have seen the tracking information we've been doing. I just want to run through some of this. This is the Global Museum Reopening Tracker. I can send this to you in PDF format, by the way, because I've just seen everybody just lean in to try and read what's saying. What it would say, so we started this track out fairly early days when museums around the world, we were kind of on the left-hand side, it was red. Most countries had closed their museums. We're now on version 7 of this. And I think what's worth saying is that actually the majority of countries have allowed their museums to reopen. And what I'd say is that this data here sets out in any given country when they're allowed to reopen the museums, but you will see at a regional country level museums making their own programs. So for example, the example we gave was museums in the UK being able to open from July. However, many of the nationals are planning a phased approach right the way through until the autumn. I think you'll see that in all of these countries as well. The silver lining to this cloud, if we look for it, and I've mentioned it already, is everybody else is opening up before us. I know that's slightly depressing, and some of you are kind of chomping at the bit to get back open. What it means is that we can learn from what everybody else is doing. So I ran through some really high-level case studies. We're going to look in more detail at some tomorrow. But let's learn, let's see what everybody else is doing, and let's see what's working, what's not. And using networks, there's a large number of forums through Nemo, through Alva, and I know that a lot of colleagues around the world are quite keen to collaborate on events as well and join events. So reach out to colleagues in other countries, particularly if you know there's institutions that have a similar setup to yourselves. It's quite a useful thing to know. So do try and learn where you can. So just looking at the chat function, an interesting one here about volunteers creating a quiz. And I think it's about kind of volunteer engagement and about thinking about ways to engage with them. And there's specific portals for volunteers and blogs. For you guys to kind of keep an eye on this in the chat function. I think it's quite an interesting, very interesting discussion that needs to take place. So this tracker here, apologies, it's quite data dense, is we're actually looking just on just individual institutions in different countries. And what you're seeing here is a broad trend. So on the left-hand side, it just lists out the institution, the visitor numbers. There's a block called what is currently open, and you'll see that most of them are opening up grounds and exhibitions are the ones that we're putting in here. However, you're seeing things like the cloak rooms particularly are something that we're not seeing open in many institutions at all. A lot of them are finding ways to reopen their shops, and they are finding ways to open their cafes in slightly different ways. As you saw from the Auckland video, that may just be for takeaway, or it may be in other ways as well. That they are limiting access to some galleries, and I think that's quite normal and will be an expectation. A key thing for a number of you to think about is if you are a paid attraction, does that expectation shift if you're paying for entry? I think the way to mitigate that as much as possible is explain to visitors so they're very clear before they buy their tickets. They know what's going to be open, what's not, and then hopefully you can overcome some of these. On the right-hand block, you've got the current measures in place. And again, some of the trends that we alluded to. Physical distancing, so at 2 meters, the UK isn't unique. However, it is further apart than a significant number of other countries. And I know the UK government is looking, they're working with colleagues over in the Netherlands and Belgium, I think, to look and see how they're managing to reduce that physical distancing down from 1.5 to maybe 1.5 or 1 meter. So that's something that may change going forward. Temperature checks we're seeing in some countries, but not others. Enhanced cleaning we're seeing everywhere. And it's thinking about things if you have audio guides about whether they're available or not, so they're not always being made available. Different approaches to PPE, and groups is one of the things that we're seeing a lot of institutions just not allowing groups in, and they're stating this on their website. And so it's quite useful to go and visit some of these websites, see how other institutions are communicating across, and getting their message out there around what they're opening and what they're not. So this is just another story. This is just cut of the same one. I'm not going to go through some detail. Sorry, it's just I cut the data in slightly different ways in case you couldn't see it. So this is the same as the previous slide. However, you can maybe just see it in a bit more detail around what's open and what's not in these different institutions. Obviously, a lot of TBCs, we've been trying to get data on a number of these, but haven't been able to. And that's just the same data. So I'm going to skip through that really quickly. A summary of the key global trends. Maximum building capacity is varying and continues to vary. A lot of states and countries are changing their guidance, and so it changes over time. So models need to change over time as well. Many are setting their own programs for reopening. Many measures such as social distancing are consistent across regions, but things like health checks we tend to see in some countries and not others. Although we're hearing on the chat here that some UK institutions are, or visitor attractions at least, are thinking about this. No two museum experiences are the same, so any solution is going to be different, and it's all about how you interpret these at your local level. And there's a number of areas of operation which appear yet to be resolved. For example, PP for staff and use of toilets. So we'll talk more about those. Again, another quote, just like take a quick sip of water. I'm sure you can all read this, but it just says, museums are not islands. Like any other work, the success of museums happens in a global context. In times of crisis, it is most important to support transnational collaboration, to learn from each other, to benchmark and to create a stronger voice for common concerns, networks, an important platform for this. So this has come from Nemo, but I think this is kind of echoed across the piece. There's some fantastic forums. So don't just look for forums in the UK, equally look for some that are happening internationally as well. And there's a lot of involvement taking place there. So this one may be of interest to you. So I just wanted to spend just a couple of minutes on this. It's another tracker that I've been publishing. It's further behind because obviously the UK hasn't been opening up, but we're starting to set out how UK attractions are reopening. So these are the ones that are publishing reopening. So as you'll see, most of these are houses and gardens and parklands, but it's interesting to see the types of trends in reopening from these places and what we can look to learn from these. So obviously these are institutions, primarily if you look National Trust properties, gardens, Kew Gardens, Wisley, who are working with the same restrictions that you currently have in place and you are currently planning for. So it's interesting to see how they respond. Probably the most interesting block, I think, is the one in the middle about what is currently opening, or what will be open on opening day if they're kind of planned ahead, is that they're opening grounds and outdoor exhibits, but the indoor areas are all closed. So for those sites, if they do have indoor buildings, you would have seen the announcement that came out today. I know there's a lot of lobbying that's come through about zoos, and safari parks can now reopen from the 15th. Similarly, they're now being told they reopen, but if they have internal buildings such as reptile houses, was the example I saw given, that those can't open. So but there's an awful lot to learn from these. So indoor exhibits aren't open. Toilets, so opening up, a number of sites are limiting their access to toilets, so it depends how many toilets you've got on site. This is going to be a core discussion point going forward, which is, if you limit toilet accessibility, are you limiting the ability for some visitors to come to your site, and what messaging does that put out? They've obviously got good reasons around this. Maybe they have larger sites and can't manage all those toilets. I think Kew Gardens gave the example that they were actually going to be having front of house staff managing people in and out of the toilets. I think Stephen actually said that for Museum of London as well. He talked about their toilets becoming unisex because they'd be able to, because effectively there'd be a member of staff escorting somebody in and out of the toilets. So your toilet capacity is going to go down. Toilets are a real area of potential conflict with front of house staff if they're expected to manage this. Queuing, some visitors can't queue, some may need those toilet facilities immediately. How do those conflict situations get resolved? We'll talk about that tomorrow. Cafes. So a large number of these sites have not opened their cafes, particularly the internal cafes, restaurant buildings. You may see takeaway coffee facilities within this, although they say closed, they may be doing takeaways. It's something to think about. Children's play areas and galleries are closed across the board. So these sites, although they're outside, any children play areas just aren't open at the moment. I think they see them as high contact areas. A really important probably piece of messaging, and similarly for you, a slightly different context, but if your interactive galleries, your particularly those for younger visitors, are going to be closed, that's probably something your visitors want to know about really early on. Particularly as well, I'm envisioning there's going to be a significant audience of families who've been in lockdown who'll be looking for opportunities to go out there. Museums and galleries may offer those spaces. They may have certain expectations. Shops, as it stands at the moment, a large number of them have their shops closed. They're not finding solutions to open up their shops. Paynes Hill, similar to the example I think Museum of London said, that they maybe think about online and just do collection only, or kind of click and collect approach. Some only have the garden centres open. So these are obviously National Trust type properties, but I think it's worth looking at how they're approaching these. And equally, from day one, they're reopened, but actually a lot of their sites are closed. So you're going to have a very different experience on site with these than if you were somewhere else. But looking to some of the broader trends, yes, they're all pretty much looking for, you need to pre-book tickets. A number of them putting PPE in for staff, hand gel, enhanced cleaning. We're not seeing health checks. I might put in the Legoland example into this one if they publish that online, but they are encouraging physical distancing, as you're seeing across the board as well. So just out of interest, we're going to keep updating this as we move towards, and as museums and galleries start publishing their plans, we're going to start to publish those in this tracker as well, and this is freely available online. You can email me directly if you want to be added to the mailing list just to get kind of free PDFs. I'm quite happy to share this if people find it helpful. I can't see Elizabeth, but I'm sure she's probably looking at me at the moment because I'm aware we're just in the last few minutes of this. Again, sorry, this is just various cuts of the same data. I can send you PDFs of this, so just let me know, or via Elizabeth, and or we may just at the end of this, I'll give you a copy of the PDFs to go out with the final email after the course. So, what are the lessons learned from the broader trends? The majority of the country are allowing museums to reopen. This provides the UK with plenty of case studies. Some trends are more regional, so don't expect all of those global trends to be implemented at a UK level, such as health checks, but you may see them come in. For UK sites that are open, parks and gardens, not all facilities are. So although they say they're open, they're not fully open. You may be thinking about a similar model as you go through.